Welcome to the American University of Paris. To introduce our next keynote speaker in 2 minutes is virtually, and I'd say also factually impossible. So forgive me if I won't even try. And I think you can actually forgive me easily because Kenneth Gergen really needs no introduction. What I would like to ask you to do instead is to think of your first encounter, or if you want to, a significant encounter you have had with Kenneth Gergen and his work. And if you allow me, I'd like to share mine. I first met Kenneth Gergen about 20 years ago. I was a freshman at Freie Universität Berlin, and I stumbled into a seminar, officially personality psychology, for whatever reason. A seminar that was dedicated solely to reading a book by Ken. The book had just been published in German and carried the title Eine Hinführung zum sozialen Konstruktionismus. Now, the English title of this book is, of course, an invitation to social construction. The German Hinführung carries a somewhat different connotation than the English invitation. It means to bring someone somewhere, to somewhat forcibly guide someone to go somewhere. Well, whatever it was, the invitational character or the gentle push, Kenneth has been occupying a growing and prominent section of both my virtual and factual bookshelves ever since. More so, he leaves this enframing of the shelf to relate to me through his writings, and from there on to my thinking, and through that also to my students. It is a distinct pleasure to ask Ken to take center stage and relate to our discussions. Kenneth?
Yes, thank you, Martin, very much. I actually remember that occasion. And I would very much like to continue our encounter. To prepare for today, I went and looked up to see about your life and realized we share so much in common. I would like to read your works. I would like to have a conversation with you. I think we could have a significant encounter even now. I also want to congratulate you and your colleagues for arranging this incredible conference. This is really quite a landmark event, somehow springing from nowhere and inviting people in from globally to share in really important issues in terms of where we are, what we're doing, and where we're going. I look at this as an experiment into the future, and we may make mistakes, but this is the frontier, and you are exploring it, and I also appreciate your allowing me to take part. Now, I also realize that we have an audience for whom English is a second, third, fourth language. I will try to speak slowly, but if I become excited, I may lose that potential. Just to be clear a little bit, I've divided this into sort of 3 sections as a talk. The first one has to do with the global challenge, the condition in which we are now and what it portends. The second one is really on metaphysics, that is refiguring metaphysics, why we should do that. I will unfold. And finally, reshaping the social sciences, because I think if we understand this properly, we can no longer think of social science in quite the same way. And I will try to bear that out and bring it back to some of the issues with which I start. Now, in terms of the challenge, I want to begin with 2 themes, which to me have been really important. The first one I'll call a consciousness of construction. There's the way in which somehow the COVID crisis in which we're in has brought forward a sense of we together. And began for me in very small ways, with hearing from people I hadn't heard from after the quarantines began. For years, would just pop up and say, how are you? What's happening? And so on. Then there were family meetings where we wouldn't necessarily meet through the extended family, but we would have Zoom meetings on weekends and refamiliarize ourselves with what's going on in each other's lives. Conferences like this springing up. And amidst all that, a sense of we're all in this together. And that phrase continues to circulate. That sense of we on this globe are living this out together, and the future, our future depends on how we relate within this context. Now that's been very impressive to me. It's been singular importance. The second theme that has been important to me is the sense that here we are in a very special space where we're faced with a world crisis and the time to reflect. That is, how did this come to be, and will this enharbinge a new way of thinking about the future? Will something come of this? Will we have learned anything? How do we refigure our own lives, our professional lives, our personal lives in light of this? Now, lately, I have been really concerned that somehow these two themes, which had so much promise, are not converging. That is, here we are with this sense of consciousness of connection and the possibility for doing something, but in fact, nothing will happen. In fact, we'll just go back as people we are already doing, looking forward to returning to our lives, doing the same things we have always done, and it will be sound and fury, signifying nothing. Just another chapter, another turn, and life goes back to normal. I think that would be a grave shame. But we don't have a very good track record in this regard. I mean, as a world, after the First World War, we tried to do a League of Nations, for example. Now we can finally get things together and decide together on the future. And that disappeared. United Nations, after the Second World War, again, another start, a fresh start. And what happens? It's become now a political stage, power relations, jockeying, and so on, or gain, for avoidance of loss, for power. The climate accord, we can scarcely get it together, and still with the climate accord, we may or may not participate, as our president shows us. And other countries are not doing their bit. And why should we do our bit? Because we haven't had a chance to benefit from ravaging the climate yet. And so on. The bickering continues. And even with COVID, as I say, it's bothersome to me, because now it's, for us in the United States, it's become totally politicized. It's become part of party politics. It's become street processions. It's groups with guns in the street protecting our rights to do what we want, and then the other side claiming, no, it's we have to honor each other and protect each other. And now the scientific community is being invited to divide on this score. And profiteering is now taking place. I read yesterday that in the United States, the 600 billionaires in our country have gained enormous $400 billion out of the COVID crisis. So again, what is the hope that we can return to normal? Now, the difficulty, and as I said, this is a grave problem, because for me, this is in some way a wake-up call. This is just the beginning. This is a possibility. Already the Wuhan scientists are discovering the possibility of multiple additional viruses that we are not at all prepared for. That's just the beginning. There's also the changes in the climate, which are bringing about the drying up of water sources on the one hand, the increases in the oceans on the others, the disappearance of shorelines, of islands, and so on. They expect by the end of this century, the water level could go up as much as 7 feet, which would destroy most of the major cities, many of the major cities in the world. People would change, crisis, conflict, and so on. We are not organized as a world to deal with even the COVID. What will we do then? And then layer on to that, the digital world, in which within a moment we can be in contact with people all over the world, in which a new development or a new crisis can suddenly spread, a new idea suddenly change the configuration of how we relate, which the stock market can move back and forth depending on what happens in any country. A political tweet can bring forth death, destruction. So you compound all that, major changes, world changes, rapid, intense movement, the likes of which we are not prepared for. We are not prepared for physically.
Sorry, I don't know that one.
Mentally. Now, let me move to part 2 of this, which has to do with metaphysics. Because there's a sense, I must say, in which I sometimes feel helpless about all this, that we have in various ways unleashed the power of change, over which we have no control, over which we cannot organize ourselves, over which we cannot agree on even the slightest things with people down the street, even when we're under desperate conditions. So what of the future? Now, there's much to be said about this, and it would be silly of me to suggest that the way in which I'm going here is the only way, but for me, I think it is one way and potentially of profound importance. It has to do with metaphysics, in a sense. It has to do with the very grounds through which we think about these things, through which we talk about them. How it is that we understand our world. Now, the one way of putting it is that we metaphysically live in a world of things, of objects, a kind of an atomistic world. It's a sort of a Democritus world of the world is made up of elements or bounded units. Right? So that if I describe my room here to you, I could describe the books, the machinery, the phones, and so on. It would be like an inventory of the room. And likewise, we each live right now in these small boxes, each with a name on it, as we're attending this lecture. We understand the world that way, so that when we talk about together, what we're really talking about is separate units meeting, converging, discussing, trying to reach an agreement. So we talk about the United Nations, but it's the nations first, the united is second. It has to do with the nature of research, of the way in which we have units, which allows us to understand cause and effect, one unit impinging on another unit. In fact, it is very difficult to think otherwise once you live in a world of units, of atoms. Why would anything move? It would move because it has intrinsic needs to move. For us psychologists, inheritance or brain structure, or it moves because it's causally forced or required to move by virtue of stimuli, as we put them. So experiments indeed are based on that logic. Experiments are cause and effect prediction. It's very difficult to think of it's difficult to think outside that logic. It's difficult to think outside that logic in terms of ethics. What do we mean by ethics in the sense of, let's say, love for the other, care for the other, be compassionate for the other? Because it already begins with, I am the compassionate, I am the one who cares, I am the one who loves the other. Do unto others as you would do unto yourself, as the Christians would say. It's a very ethic which is steeped in that whole notion of separation, division. Our language for understanding, indeed, I cannot in English, if I'm going to do anything in the way of account for the world, I cannot but use nouns for persons, places, things, that is, bounded units. My very way of communicating now is already dividing, ripping apart the world in ways that I have no control over because it's virtually the only way I can talk with you. How could it be otherwise? How could we develop a way of understanding that would not be based on the units, in which the relational process would come first, in which relations are not formed by two separate entities. It's the relational process out of which, indeed, the very idea of an entity might or might not emerge. How could we then begin to rethink, redo relationships? What if the ethic were indeed one which would say, let's care for the process out of which we become? Now, it's not easy to indeed even imagine such an ontology, such a metaphysic, because the only way we can articulate it is using the language we already have, which is indeed divisive and based on entities, separations. So we have this clumsy language for trying to understand something which would unite us, which would not unite us, which would be start off with the way in which we are already deeply, deeply related. And it's almost a mirage to think that there is separation here. It's technically, it looks like separation, but it's not separation at all. This is a process in itself. Now, I do think that we are on the verge of that kind of way of thinking. In this century, at least for us in the West, I think it was there most prominently in Wittgenstein. When we turn from language as description and getting its meaning from the nature of the world to language getting its meaning from basically social usage, from the language game. The notion of game is that it is something that I can't play alone. The social usage, I cannot play it alone. So that when Wittgenstein sort of focuses on the language game and then begins to undertake a critique of psychological states, for example, he's basically placing psychology as the very idea of psychology as a kind of an outgrowth of the game. Now that kind of thinking gets picked up as we move through this last century in a variety of ways, and I'm not going to go through them at all. but you can recognize it for those of you who've been around for 20 years, and ethnomethodology, the way in which groups create the sense of what is the case. It is there certainly in conversation analysis, where you begin to look at the whole conversation as having a coherence in itself. It's certainly there in a lot of social constructionist work. And I'll take this all the way back to Thomas Kuhn and cultures of science. So the idea of a process giving rise to the difference is there. It's the kind of thing I have tried in relational being to put together as relational processes the prior to all understanding. Now, let me just say a little about that, to take language as the exemplar. I didn't make up all these words. They're not coming out of my brain, nor did anyone else make up the words in terms of meaningful words, because meaning itself required some kind of agreement, some sort of coordination before the words meant anything. And until there was that coordination, there isn't anything. So if you don't speak some form, if you don't speak English at all, this is just sounds. And what they mean depends on how you pick them up and what you do with them, over which I have no control. I am simply part of a process out of which I participated, and now out of in which you are participating. We can't pin down the meaning of anything that is said. That is because once you start playing with what is said, you're already in the next line, the next iteration of the co-creation of meaning. So to pick up the conversation is to change the conversation. It is to move it in a given direction. And the very notion of an I, as you can see, a pronoun, comes out of that process. So the I, we're all secondary to the process. Now, why is this important? Because it means that virtually everything I say and do, including the gesture, for example, of my hand, everything I wear, all the books on virtually everything around me, everything that means anything, emerges from that process. So it's the process that is sacred in some way. The process is that which needs to be nurtured. That if we have any ethic at all, it's an ethic which, to have indeed a sense of ethic, is indeed provided by that process. So to care at all about anything is to indeed owe it to the process, not to you and not to me, but to that process in its generative form. And I underscore its generative form because that process can also turn back on itself in terms of how we ontologies we create, the institutions we create. It can turn back on itself to lead to exactly the condition we are in now, which is basically at each other's throat, watching out for our own country, our own community, our own selves, our own nation, our own political party, our own religion. And the commons, the process itself, no one really cares for that. How could we do that? Now that leads me basically to the third part of this talk, which is where do we go from here? How do we? Let me reserve this to the social sciences and particularly psychology, because most of our audience here is in psychology. let's go back a moment to think about psychology and indeed social sciences in general. The logic in which gave them power in the early 20th century, the logic which was commanding, which gave them the right to have courses of study and be parts of universities and be parts of science, was based on there being some object to study. One had to have something, some topic, something which could be examined, observed, hopefully measured, which one could study and do research, that is, go back and study it again to see if the study was, if one's conclusions were appropriate or correct. One could build theory, which would allow one to integrate conclusions about the nature of the topic, for example, cognition or emotion, depression, mental illness. To establish knowledge, which would be incremental, thus books and journals and so on, building on each other, the bricks in the wall go up, and which would allow us to predict and control the future. Just be able to know what is good educational pedagogy, for example. What would cure mental illness? How could we generate better thinking, more improved cognition, and so on? How would we develop emotional control or create well-being in our communities, and so on? Now, I hope you're beginning to see that what I'm doing here is spelling out a condition, a way of thinking, which is losing credibility. It's losing credibility. That is, what kind of social activity remains solid enough to study it? What in our human life remains permanent enough that you can go back and you can search it and search it again? Anthropology virtually disappears because there aren't any more landlocked cultures to study. All the cultures have sort of seeped through each other. We don't have cultures anymore, we have culturing. By the time you've studied a political scene, you study politics, you write it up, publish it, 2 years later, when it's published, that scene no longer exists. I have a brother who works in political policy making in our government at one point, and he said, sociology, we don't take it seriously. We don't take any of the studies seriously. And we're talking about massive numbers. He said, it's like journalism in slow motion. Because it's politically loaded, and we understand that, but by the time we get it, all the figures are different, scene is different. I mean, in terms of reporting, nothing remains more than through a news cycle almost. We have been through one crisis in government after another, week after week after week here, because each news cycle demands a new drama. And one can scarcely remember the political crisis of 3 weeks ago, or hold anyone responsible for it. So what do we have as a discipline that relies on examining, measuring, reporting, publishing, eventually hoping someone will read? We don't even write in ways that other people can read what we say. Why would they care? So it's not as if somehow we're doing wondrous things already. Even our critical work, who does it reach? It may reach the people who are already sort of, they're already the crowd. They're our friends, our neighbors. Other people don't read it. It's the same with politics. You don't read the political news on the other side because you know it's tainted. And that bothers me, and in some sense, it's another topic about how we understand the nature of academic work. But I want to turn to another aspect of it, which has to do with metaphysics again. It is, if you wanted to study, let's say the hand, you could, and I hold it there long enough, you can study it and you research it, you can measure it and so on, no problem. However, if that hand is continuously moving, it is very difficult to say when a configuration is returned and will it ever be there again? And anything I say now will not exist, will be irrelevant tomorrow. And that's sort of the way in which we live our lives. What if we think in terms of relational process? That the task is not to put a box around the thing, to know it better, whatever the it is, but it's to move with the flow, to be engaged in the flow, in the ongoing process, and just to be engaged in that process to make a difference. That's the point of doing social science. Because we have been, because of our sort of ontology of difference, we think of subjects and objects as we, the scientists, as sort of mirrors to nature, that is trying to reflect it accurately. And our job is to report, comment, to theorize about it. What if we shifted in this sort of process ontology, this relational way of thinking? Let's make things. Let's move from mirroring to making. Let's move into being future forming activists, creating the future. As it has been said in other contexts, the best way to predict the future is to make it happen. And our task is not so much that of reporting on it now, but move together to have a force, a coactive force for creating a future that we care about, that is important to us, that we believe is somehow better than the way in which we exist now, and that it has some hope for the future. Now, what would that look like? I'm not necessarily saying we should give up everything we've done and let's go, I'm not for abandoning the past. The past is always a resource. But you might say reshifting the focus into a concern with the future. And if I go back to this relational view, it is the future in which the well-being of the relational process is most important, and which should in some way be the dominant ethic if we wish to stay alive. What would that mean? Now, again, I don't have all the answers. I mean, really, this is the beginning of a conversation for me. What would it mean for theory? Many years ago, I tried to make an argument for generative theory, that is, theory which did not so much collect the facts and try to integrate everything, but theory which actually changed the way we looked at things, which would open up new possibilities. Now I'm all right with that, but now I see that generative theory in terms of not just opening up possibilities, but inviting us into them. I mean, Marxist theory in some way did that. It was a theory which not only was a theory about, but it was a theory with, it said, let us unite to create. And in some ways, I think in some way, the sentiment was right. but the way in which it ends up is, again, is in a bounded area of us against them. The continuous generation of relational ways of thinking that bring us into the with, maybe even doing those with people, so that theories aren't some ones, they are dialogically unfolding. What about research? The very notion of research that we inherit is already a problem, in a sense that I study you or we study them. Already the division is there. I talk about you. I know about you. It seems to me we've got to move toward a research in which we are, which it is collective. We co-inquire. Co-inquire. This also obviously would lead to forms of action research in which we co-make, which we as scholars work with people to make things happen. I have colleagues in Santiago, Chile, who work in communities, destitute communities, to help those communities together lift themselves up. Say, we have resources if we can move together. Let's explore those resources. There are other people who would help us. There are other groups that would help us. Let us explore those possibilities. They've been such incredible success working in these communities to bootstrap them into a better condition, that the government now has set up an office to help them. Marvelous. These are academics who changing the nature of Santiago life. So not only theory, research, but there's another feature here which is really important to me. It has to do with actually changing forms of lives themselves. Now, it's interesting when you go to the natural scientists that it's not so much it's not so much the theories that they've had, it's not so much the research that's been so impressive that puts them on the map of cultural significance. Actually, the byproducts. What have they done? What happens now? Can you do biology and you can make better crops, or you can stop the deterioration of soil, or in medicine, can you cure diseases? Relativity theory is not so important until you get to atomic physics and the possibility that you can now create atomic power and, unfortunately, weapons. What comes out of the social sciences in terms of actual creations, of actual things, in Wittgenstein's sense, forms of life, the invention, creation, establishment of forms of life. Now, here's a good example of psychology would be Jaakko Seikkala in Finland. Now, there's a lot of criticism, for example, of psychodiagnosis. And again, the oppressive way in which it divides us, the way in which it creates alienated relationships of power, the way in which it's brought about psychopharmacology and the drugging of hundreds of thousands of people who can scarcely get off these drugs. I mean, there's a lot of critique. But the critique is simply countered by additional critique from the other side, counter critique. But what Seikkala has done is to create an alternative to diagnosis. It's created something called open dialogue, which brings in, doesn't silence the voice of the psychiatrist or clinical psychologist, but that person becomes part of a dialogue with, let's say, a social worker, with, let's say, the client, patient, with the family, with friends, with a priest, people who know them well. And they talk openly about what can we do? And where should we go from here? And how would that look? So it's kind of a collective way of understanding what they might consider a problem and moving forward. And now that practice moves around the world. Marvelous, marvelous. I must say that Seikulo's work has been enormously important to me as a way of trying to think about what I do. And I've had the privilege of working with Sherto Gill, a British scholar, on problems of education, and particularly testing, evaluation as testing, measurement of students, and the way in which education has become about scoring high, about competition to score, and enormous problems with that, in terms of the way in which they do not prepare us to relate with each other at all. They prepare us for difference, competition, and self-containment. So what we've tried to do is to not only generate a critique of that, but to draw from multiple sources around the world of groups that are trying to do otherwise, to do something that we're calling relationally rich evaluation. That is where evaluation becomes, let's say, part of a dialogic process. Not I evaluate you, but what has happened here, and how can we think about this, and what would be a good way to go, and what interests you, and how would that relate to the community, and so on and so on. Bring in parents, bring in other students, bring in faculty, but don't allow it to be I judge you, I measure you on this form. And how would that work in not only enriching evaluation, but allowing the people to develop in different ways, not in terms of some kind of overarching form which is required by government, but in multiple ways, which would indeed enrich the relational process itself. Because if I am teacher, I'm judging you and scoring you, it's a far different relationship that we have, for example, than if I say, what do we have here and how do we understand it and how could we do this better? What would that look like? So it's a way of trying to draw in the relationship and enriching that at the same time that education occurs. And hopefully we'll have a book coming out with Oxford University Press on Beyond the Tyranny of Tests, Relational Evaluation in Education. But I also fear it's a book. And where will that go? And how could that be part of the conversation? But there's more to the forms of life. I also think of the place of us as psychologists and social scientists in social movements. How do we join, inform, and become parts of these movements? Now, we are indeed, many of us, parts of those movements, but often they're negatively disposed. They're also against something. And I'm drawn up in that, aren't we all? Aren't we all? But to be against something may be a first step, but it in some sense is also to create a counterforce and more antagonism. So how could we even join those kinds of movements which bring us together? How could we encourage them? I really like the Hearing Voices movement, of which I and a number of other colleagues are parts of. Because it's not just saying, oh, psychiatry is wrong, it's saying, look, this is part of what humans do. It's another way of looking at it. And there are ways that when we share our stories together, can do things differently and not be frightened and not have to seek out drugs and look at ourselves somehow as strange people. That we together can band together and create resources for ourselves. And finally, I think it's a matter of creating organizations. That is actually creating, you might say, ongoing institutions, which for me would add to the relational process, which would contribute to that. I must say that one of the stars, the real stars in my firmament, has been part of this conference, Sunil Bhatia, who, although is an outstanding scholar, has also formed a nonprofit, bringing in other nonprofits, other organizations together to work on sanitation issues in the slums of India. Amazing contribution to a problem that may sound trivial, but it is not. It's a major problem for these slums. Having an impact, an enormous impact outside academics. That to me is a kind of an ideal. It's a treasured one. So that's my piece for today. It's been perhaps less academic in itself than you might anticipate, but these are unusual times, and I hope I've reached to some of you. So thank you, Martine. I appreciate it. I'm not hearing.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for a powerful talk. Now it happened to me finally that I forgot to turn on my microphone. Wonderful. It's part of an online conference. I hope you can hear me now. Thank you, Kenneth, for drawing maybe three and a half, maybe 4 different strands here that we can try and bring together or take further apart. We'll see in the discussion. I think you started out maybe with a grim picture of the current state. At the same time, you injected maybe moments of, is it hope, moments of change in there already, saying we're coming together in a different way during this lockdown. Then you also spoke about hope, and hope in terms of what we already know, the metaphysics that we already understand, the process philosophy that we maybe already have, that we don't have to invent. But then also you said, well, how do we maybe bring this to the everyday life, to the ground, to our life, living together? How can we think process, or how can we live process philosophy in an everyday interaction? It's a little bit like, I don't know, the mathematicians can think in 14 dimensions, but we cannot live in 14 dimensions. Or the physicists can think in terms of quantums and how quantums relate to each other, but we cannot live that kind of world of quantums here in the social realm. You talked then a lot about what is, I think, one of the central themes of this conference so far also, namely, what are we doing? What is the social sciences? What are the social sciences doing? And I particularly like the contrast that you also pointed to with the natural sciences, right? What are physics doing? Well, physics, they research the physical world, but they also change it. What is biology doing? Well, biology is changing the biological world to an extent. What are the social sciences doing? Well, to a large part, we look at the social world and then try to describe it, and oftentimes actively distance ourselves from what is going on, oftentimes actively shy away from being political. And I hear what you're saying as a call for more political engagement. You mentioned Sunil's contribution, who's speaking tomorrow here. Where I want to enter is where I want to enter our discussion is with the current crisis. And what I would like to ask you first is, in this moment where we're all told to stay away from each other, the term itself, socially distancing, right? Social distancing. Is this really a step backwards? And if I want to use your terminology, are we going to more towards what you described as the bounded self? Are we losing relations in this very moment? And then possibly, how can we gain them back?
Yeah. It's a wonderful question. I think I've gone through phases on this. I think early on, I found it very hopeful. It was like an awareness that was taking place of, yes, we are connected through history and time and space. And I remember in the early stages of this, loving a performance by the Rotterdam Symphony in which a given performer was playing on his instrument or her instrument, and then it would be joined by another one and another one. You know, now this has become common. And by the end of it, they are all playing together, and it's Beethoven's Ode to Joy, and it was like fantastic. Now that's become commonplace, and what the phase that I find myself in now is that if we are physically apart for so long, will it matter? That is, will the social cease to matter in the way that it has? For example, I love the idea of what you've done here with this conference, in which you've brought people in from all over the world. But I long for that presence. And if we cease ever to have that presence, or at least can go on and on and on without it, without the presence of our students, without the presence of meetings where we somehow know each other more fully, that something will be lost. That the something which is powerful, which is, you might say, the glue that really holds us together, will be lost. I don't know. I mean, I know that people can go through. There was a case a couple of years ago of a man who was secluded, who played chess with only on a digital platform with other people, but they played every day together. He didn't know any of them, knew them by name. They would have, divide up, and they played chess together. Or no, it was bridge. Bridge together. And when he was dying, he wanted his computer, his laptop, brought to his deathbed so he could be with the people he felt closest to. So I don't want to rule out the possibility for real powerful relationships which are held together digitally, but I worry about it and the loss of that connection and what it will do to us in the long run.
Do you have an idea how we can turn this current situation maybe into what you have termed a wake-up call?
How we can do, well, I mean, what I've laid out in terms of social science would be one of those things. I mean, partly, you look for a more immediate steps. One can take the steps right in their own universities or departments or wherever they work. I mean, why is it that we only honor, for example, written work in esoteric journals? Why is that the mark of significance? Why shouldn't social change, creation, be indeed honored, bringing our potentials into change? And that could actually make a difference. One could actually begin to ask, and this is an easy one, why do we grade students in the way we do, as if there's some kind of desideratum that everyone should shape into, and that we indeed hold the keys to that, and somehow if it disappears, everybody will be lazy and know nothing. Why do we could challenge that in our own educational systems? And the reason I say that it's invited, because already universities are saying, here at least, let's not use national tests anymore because we can't trust them now anymore. Or let's not have grades at the end of this semester because now everybody is online. We don't need to, we can't grade them as we have. What if we don't have to? What if the challenge now is to say, let's look at some other ways of what we say evaluation, in which we care for those people. We help nourish their education. We're not setting bars up for them to jump over. So those would be, I mean, these are off the top of my head, but they're not insignificant.
Yeah, and you, I mean, you have done this kind of work, and you have engaged in both practice and theorizing of performative social sciences. I'm wondering here, once you are in the kind of position where you have the freedom to do that, once you are, and then in the academic world, this would be the tenured professorship. And I mean, today, even that becomes at some institutions questionable given the current crisis. But I mean, once you're a tenured professor, then maybe you can part from that regular path that we're often following in the social science. But then again, if I ask you now, if I bring in what you argue for, the relational self, aren't we maybe also as researchers in a kind of machine? Isn't that machine that we go through with this assistant professorship, where we have to qualify ourselves, where we have to show what we can do, actually to bind us in certain relations that will eventually, once we have achieved that level of tenured professor, stop us from doing exactly that kind of work that you hope for us, and me too, and Sunil is the one example already who's doing it differently. But I mean, isn't this machine exactly stopping us from going there, the relations that we're in?
I do think the machine for many people is hindering that, is making it difficult. But let's not assume that the machine is permanent. It is also a set of relationships in which the signifiers continue to circulate, and that you can make a difference. And particularly under these conditions, you begin to rethink what is it that we're doing, and could that be a reason for us to get together in my university, in my space, to rethink this. That who are we, and are these reasonable? Are we making a contribution by just simply as machine products turning out papers, getting grant money so the university can have better lawns or whatever. So that discussion, it seems to me, is invited by this very condition. This is the opportunity for that kind of discussion.
I want to turn to the questions that are coming in, because the list is getting rather long, even though I would have many more questions on my own, but this is for the audience here. If you have questions, please use the Q&A tool to post them. I'll just start at the top with Marie-Cécile's question. She says, I fully and wholeheartedly support what you have been saying, Ken. Thank you so much. Concerning the question you posed, what kind of social activity remains permanent enough for our inquiry curiosity? What would you say if I propose language activity as the very dynamics of change and permanence, of permanent change with slow moving permanencies? Language in a process philosophical view, asking us to go with its flow if we take it seriously.
Yeah. All right, now my constructionist frame comes in here. It's to say, look, you can do that. One could do that. And indeed, there are many people who do take that as their kind of object of study of permanence. The question is, what do we gain from that? And I would ask, you know, where does that take us? What are the outcomes of that kind of way of looking at things? And I'm not saying they're insignificant, but I'd say think about them in advance. What do we gain by that way of looking at it? Because look, you can say, well, I mean spoken and written language, but what is language after all? I mean, when you get down to the nature of language and the ways we can conceptualize language, and how you might at any point conceptualize it. Could be sign language, be language of clothing, it could be language of furniture, the language of the trees are speaking to us. It becomes very difficult to specify exactly what language is. So rather than trying to say, all right, that's the permanent thing, let's say rather, this is a way of looking at it. And if we look at it this way, this is what could come out of it. This is what we might gain. I mean, I must say that I do have some reservations about the way in which conversation analysis has gone, because I love that as an original way to go, but within 10 years or so, it became kind of dry, antiseptic, and moved out of the range of common understanding or appreciation. And I may be wrong about that because I haven't looked at all of that, but as I've sort of tried to keep up with what's happening, I have worried about it.
I want to connect Mark Gimignani, or Gimignani. I'm sorry, you give me permission to say your last name, but I might mispronounce it. I'm very sorry. To this, who goes on from language to one of the things that we have discussed a lot at this conference, and that is narrative. And he says, in the current context of the COVID pandemics, the dominant narrative concerns population control, biopolitics, and scientific, biological, medical knowledge. Could you talk about the ways in which a relational ontology can instead provide an alternative reading of the virus and the pandemic? What could be some consequences of adopting this ontology, especially for psychologists?
Just coming off, out of nowhere, I mean, Marco's, thank you very much. I love your question. But just to sort of leap into that, oh, well, now I can tell you, that would be, facetious. I'm not sure where to dig into that. Here's the difficulty, and the reason it requires some preliminary thought. Whatever I do, I'm going to have to take that clumsy language of thingness, I'm going to have to specify in some ways a topic or a process or area or something. I'm going to have to create a world of units. And I don't want to objectify that world, but in order to get anything done at this point, I almost have to use that language. So I have to be careful about what I would want to do with that. Because already, for example, in a number of the talks here, there's been a pretty good sensitivity to the way in which narratives flow into various sorts of activities in which we're engaged and move through politics, move through commerce, move through our day-to-day activities. I mean, they become, I would say, relationally sensitive in many respects. So then I would want to ask, well, what I could probably get into these kinds of analyses, and I am prone to it, but then the question is, what would come out of that particular way of doing it? Because we're all clever enough, given all the resources at our disposal, to take different perspectives and weave them together to find a new narrative, or a way of narrative disintegration, or new narratives, or combination, or or there is nothing outside of narrative. I mean, we have a lot of resources. So I'd just be careful about choosing the topic, the way of doing it, that would somehow give us what I would call, and for me, an ethically or value way of valuing, a valuable way to go forward, with, again, my values tending to move towards that which would contribute to the greater viability of the process.
I'm wondering how we can manifest that process in the very moment. If we take a concrete example. As some of you might know, I am currently in exile from Europe here in Egypt. I fled before they decided to make people stay in their homes. Now, we're in an interesting situation here because we're allowed to move around freely. At the same time, we have people asking, can we come over because we want to hang out with other people? But we all know we shouldn't do that. So it's interesting conversations that you have of a general kind of narrative that tells us, do not connect, do not come together. And the concrete moment of, can we relate to each other? In other words, are we capable of communicating with each other in a kind of way that we reflect the abstract risk of being infected with a virus for us, so that we decide for coming together? So
this is a really good question in a way, because it suggests that, look, do we have the resources in our everyday ways of relating to handle conflict, to handle multiple perspectives, to move from every day from one thing to another, to new conditions? Now, what I'm suggesting here is that in some way it goes back to education. We are well trained to have a position. We're well trained to have a logic and defend it. It's more difficult for us to have multiple logics for which there is no particular way of comparing them outside of another logic. And it's more difficult for us to build on other people's logic, particularly if we don't agree with it, or to change it other than trying to defeat it. So the question I'm raising is, where do we get those resources for moving fluidly with each other, so that the tone of voice you use, the way you move your hands or whatever already will convey your concern, and how is it I want very much to be with you, but this is really important somehow to do it in a way that people can take on. To know, well, he doesn't want to do that, I don't want to speak to him. And that to me is part of the future, is that is our ways of relating in a world of continuous multiplex change, where cultures are blending into each other, where conversations are never going to be the same from one year to, or even month to the next, where small words can make a difference. And are we up to that, just as human beings, to a world of change in terms of the way in which we coordinate with each other? That's one of my concerns with education.
We're already slowly running out of time, unfortunately, and there are quite a number of questions that are concerned with what you said about metaphysics. So I think I want to quickly go into that direction before I want to try and get you back to what we do on the grounds, what we maybe want to do as researchers. But nonetheless, the questions are prominent, and I'll try to convey the message here, even though it is a long one. Carmen is asking, thank you very much for this stimulating talk. I appreciate the way you bring back a question that has been raised since the beginning of metaphysical thinking, namely how we can care more for the process. But I wonder whether you end up with a binary between entities and process.
You are frozen on my screen. You are frozen. Can you hear me?
I will quickly take over and read the question to you. A binary between entities and processes that you cannot maintain. The I comes out of the process and thereby it becomes indistinguishable from it. In many ways, this was, I suppose, Heidegger's problem and the main reason why he could not argue that the meaning of being is time. My question is whether you could avoid this problem if you do not reduce metaphysics to ontology, that is, hierarchies approaching being. As you said with the example of Marx's teleology, this can easily end up with essentialized notions of us versus them. Are there ways to think of social activity as not solid and permanent, as something that cultivates openness without losing unity, a notion of intersubjectivity and relationship that keeps both subjectivity and objectivity in place?
Yeah, you have several really wonderful questions there. By the way, am I on screen now? Right now, it doesn't look like I'm.
Yes, you are. We can see you, and I'm actually back. Whew.
Right.
I said Egypt once too much, I think. Go ahead, Kenneth.
All right. So, yeah, I mean, there's several fascinating questions there, and they really take some time to unpack them. And I appreciate the sophistication of that question. Just a couple of issues. Yes, one can't ultimately form a foundation of a relational ontology or relational metaphysics without drawing from it the very idea of entities themselves. Now, as I said, we already have a language which contains the way in which we work out these theories. So unless I drop that language, I can't do a metaphysics of process. And if I can't do a metaphysics of process without the language, anyway, you see the problem. I would have to have a whole something else which you might not want to count as a logic. It might be, in a Wittgensteinian sense, a showing. That's the only way I could do it. It's the only way I can drop the binaries. The only way I can drop the objectification. The way of creating now a new difference, a new solidification, and so on. I think, in some sense, again, Wittgenstein is right that you can't ultimately justify any position of any significance like that, any ontology, any theory, any metaphysics. There's no justification because always you would have to be relying on a whole set of suppositions which aren't that, which you want to get to. So as he said, you have to kick the ladder out from under the space that you occupy theoretically because you can't justify it by virtue of the ladder. And I rather see that. So I rather look at these orientations as, again, in a pragmatic way. How could we do it? What could it mean? What can we get from it? Let's not take it in that direction. Let's try to move it in another direction. So again, it's a continuous creation in the same way that we've recreated the mind over years in order to stay afloat as a discipline. I'm sympathetic to intersubjectivity, but I tend to be post-structuralist, and I tend to not want to start with the intersubjective because now I've got to start with two worlds and worry about how they get to be inhabiting each other, and that becomes like a major issue which no one theoretically has ever been able to solve. It creates another dualism. I mean, for me, these are just some of the issues. So I tend to admire it and want to save it, but not to occupy that particular space right now.
Ken, if I may, we're almost running out of time, as I said, but I want to ask you one more question. And yes, we can have a debate on metaphysics, and there is lots to say. And we can think about relational philosophy, and there's also lots to say. Yet, one of the aspects that you pointed us to in your talk was to say, how can we act as psychologists? And that's what most of us are. We're psychologists, we're social scientists, and we unfold if we want to, our power our ability to change things in the world within maybe this academic world, within our discipline. So my question for you is maybe relatively simple. What do we do? How do we change this academic world? Because we're all in it. We're in it all the time. We go in those meetings. We have our departmental meeting. We talk about learning outcomes. We apply for research projects. We shape them. How do we shape them to produce a more relational understanding right out of the middle of this crisis?
Well, you know, there's no one answer to that. And it's the question of how do we create social change? I mean, my issue in some ways has been often we think of it as going against the power structures, against those things and getting rid of them. And I'm rather not, I find that problematic now in terms, even though I've joined those kinds of movements for a long time, of trying to work with people and to work towards trying to, of demonstrations of things that do work, of cases that can succeed, and saying, pointing to those. I've been very impressed, for example, with the way in which feminist movement changed our academic world in terms of what was required for tenure. Because we had a pretty strong sort of male view. These are the right journals, these were the numbers you needed. They had to have empirical data, blah, blah, blah. And when you had enough women who could say, look, here are some things that are really important that are missing in that, and here's how we could do them. And here's some ways in which the journals could do that. And here's some arguments and here's how they could work out. And they had some positive demonstrations, some really good arguments for why they were important. And one could scarcely not listen. I mean, they were, at least I found, and they did make a difference. So that was a whole range of journals. It was the same with, by the way, with qualitative inquiry. I mean, where did narrative come from? How did we manage to do that? I was on the first narrative symposium at American Psychological Association ever. It was jam-packed, but there were already people who was in the wind. It was like in the wind. And people could see there's excitement there. There's something you can do with it. And they could begin to say, look at what comes out of that. And now look at it. I mean, it's like, it unites a lot of this audience together from all over the world of thinking that way. So you have already made a change. You've already been part of a change. But I'd say it's been more in terms of what you've been excited about and been able to show those things and excite students with, excite your colleagues with, as opposed to saying, that's not narrative, I'm going to fight it.
Thank you so much, Kenneth Gergen. I take this as a call for all of us to put our hands in the wind and catch what is out there and see where we move. Thank you so much for being with us.
I appreciate it very much.